There have been several points over the last few years in which the US and Iran have nearly had a war. One example I remember right before COVID is when the Iranians were firing missiles at the Americans over the US killing the Iranian leader Soleimani. These tensions have been going back for decades, such as the US cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear program using Stuxnet. In this video, we're going to look into if the US and Iran had a war, who would win? I think the answers are going to surprise a lot of you, so buckle up. Wars happen when nations feel insecure, but online we need to have other ways to maintain our security. This is why I use Private Internet Access VPN. Searching the internet without a VPN is like sending a private message in a group chat. Your digital footprint is available for everyone to see, but with PIA VPN, you can keep your browser data from your internet service provider, cybercriminals, and government censors, ensuring your information is safe from any prying eyes. Not only that, but you can also access content from around the world, so if you want to watch, say, Across the Spider-Verse, but it's unavailable in your country, you can use PIA VPN to access it as if you were in another country. PIA VPN is the most transparent VPN on the market, and they never store or record your data, meaning what you do online is just between yourself and the screen. PIA goes above and beyond to protect your information like no other. And for my fans only, they're offering to let you use PIA VPN for just over $2 a month plus an additional 4 months for free. That's 83% off for anyone who uses my link in the description. So don't wait. Get PIA VPN and protect your information for the safest possible browsing experience. Click the link below to go to www.piavpn.com/whatifaultist. Before I turned this channel into whatever it is now, my speciality was alternate history, and looking backwards, I think there are definitely many timelines where America already invaded Iran in the 21st century, before 2024, when the Americans were deeply involved in the Middle East 20 years ago due to the War on Terror, where the Americans had militarily occupied and conquered Iran's neighbors Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a truism and widely believed prediction that the US would go after Iran next, the country in between those two. As of now, with the tensions going on in the Levant with the Israel-Gaza war, there is a real possibility that the US and Iran could have a war. This is since Israel is Iran's greatest enemy, while Israel is also a strong American ally. It looks pretty plausible that Israel will fight Iran's ally in Lebanon, Hezbollah. The Americans have already moved our fleet and aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf to prepare for this. From there, the war could escalate to a broader one between the US and Iran, and perhaps even further to include Persia's allies like China and Russia. This is not a video to explain this process, since I've already made that video, or to explain why the US and Iran could or would have a war. This is merely a video to start with the assumption that the US and Iran are already at war. What would that war look like and who would win? To keep this scenario as clean as possible, China and Russia are not involved, and this will only look at the war in the Middle East. In this video, we're just going to look at the US and Iran at war. I will try to not make it a bigger war. If the US and Iran are at war, it stands to reason other countries may be involved. Israel's an obvious example. However, I don't think they'd be capable of really changing the course of this war except for providing air support. Israel is hundreds of miles away from Iran, and they've had no reason to build up power projection abilities to reach Iran's borders. Also, it just geographically doesn't make sense, since none of the countries in between would politically let Israeli troops march through them, given how unpopular Israel is in the Muslim world. This would be like the US's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which it's really just America against that country they're invading. The other Anglo-Saxon countries and a few other allies, perhaps in North Europe or in the Far East, send men, but none of these countries really have enough military force to matter, so it's mostly the Americans. There are two routes the US could invade Iran through, one by land through the west and another by water. The US is unlucky, given it would have to invade Iran from the south, while Iran's capital is in the north of the country, split by an incredibly mountainous geography. The land route would involve the US starting out in the west and invading Iran through the Zagros Mountains to reach Tehran. As I make this video at the end of 2023, it's becoming so abundantly clear and embarrassing how much the Americans mishandled foreign policy in the Middle East. 15 years ago, the US had basically surrounded Iran. If we wanted to invade, it would be a lot easier back then. We had field armies of tens of thousands of men in Iraq and Afghanistan. Turkey was still a strong ally, and Pakistan was still a decent ally. If we were to invade Iran in 2005, we could have launched a four-pronged strike surrounding the country, forcing it to fight a four-front war. At that point, we could have launched attacks from Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, and the Gulf of Hormuz at the same time. They wouldn't be able to withstand this, and their industrial base would fall apart as their men gave up. We would have won easily. Now none of this is true. The great irony is that one of the largest side effects of the US's invasions of the Middle East at the start of this century has been the growth of Iranian power. We invaded these countries, destabilized them, and then didn't stick around and actually establish them as colonies or protectorates where we could have continually exerted influence over them. Instead, we came in, spent a lot of money ineffectively, thus giving corrupt local elites more money, and then left. What this has accomplished is turning Iraq into an Iranian puppet state, something that even the US military reports at this point now acknowledge. After 20 years of grinding warfare, the Taliban has finally fought back the American invaders, and now has even more legitimized itself among the Afghan people for doing so, while also having stolen massive amounts of American military equipment. Meanwhile, the war on terror has alienated Pakistan, our former ally. Pakistan originally let us host our military forces to invade Afghanistan through their country. On paper, Pakistan and the US are still allies. However, in reality, Pakistan is now one of America's biggest enemies. Pakistan is one of China's strongest allies, who is America's biggest rival, and they're also one of the biggest funders of anti-American terrorism. India, Pakistan's nemesis, is now one of America's strongest allies. It's clear at this point Pakistan would not be happy to host an American invasion of Iran. This then leads to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. These used to formerly be strong American allies. Due to a combination of their shifting self-interests and American foolishness, they've drifted apart, and it's unclear whether or not they're allies at all at this point. For the Turks, they've been on their project of recreating the Ottoman Empire. The Turks now have military bases, allies, and forces in more than half a dozen countries around the region. This project has been justified under the pretenses of returning Turkey to the Caliphate and Islamo-nationalism. With all that going on, it makes sense that they would drift further apart from the Americans, the leaders of the Western secular world. With the Saudis, the Americans stopped needing them as much as the US became the world's largest oil producer and a net oil exporter rather than importer. This meant that the US didn't need Saudi Arabia anymore. Thus, the country which became most dependent on Saudi oil turned from the US to China. With all this going on, it made strategic sense for the Saudis to become closer with China as they have. At the same time, the US also made some very serious errors here. I'm gonna try to not get too political in this video, but this is a map of US allies in the Middle East under Trump, and here's one under Biden. The Trump administration, although you may criticize it for a bunch of things, had what I believe to be the best foreign policy of any American president since the Cold War. Trump had like 10 brilliant foreign policy decisions, of which I have a text wall here to go through all of them. The Trump administration did a good job of allying with all these different factions, unifying the Turks, Israelis, Arabs, and Saudis against the Iranians. However, the Biden administration has alienated the Turks by supporting the Kurds instead. This is a really stupid decision, given Turkey is a country of 90 million people, which is an industrial powerhouse that controls the Bosphorus. We need the Turks on our side. The Kurds have literally nothing to offer us, but we supported them for social justice reasons. The Biden administration insulted the Saudis for human rights reasons. That's probably justified, but also that's not how geopolitics works. We worked with Maoist China before, and Stalinist Russia. At the same time, Saudi Arabia is improving its women's rights very quickly, while trying to modernize and industrialize very hard. If there was one time where we shouldn't spurn them for human rights reasons, it would be now. Also, why throw away allies? Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of the radical Sunni world, and alienating them also throws off our alliance we built inside the Arab world between Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Gulf. I frankly do not understand why the Biden administration's foreign policy makes the decisions it does. It seems to be about virtue signaling in America at the expense of actually rational decisions that are in the interests of us and our allies. The Saudis even signed accords with the Iranians, their sworn enemy of decades. This is very strange given the Saudis' entire thing is being the purveyors of revolutionary Sunniism, while for Iran being the purveyors of revolutionary Shiaism. This would be the equivalent of England and Spain signing a treaty of friendship in the 1500s. However, it's indicative of the Saudis losing faith in the American world system. The silver lining here is that alliances in the Middle East are so fickle and changeable that none of this is set in stone. It's a lot like early modern Europe, where France, Austria, Britain, or the Spanish were constantly switching alliances and enemies on a dime, since the politics were so complicated. A single wise American administration could probably recuperate our lost allies in the Middle East. We might look back upon this video in 2 years, where we're already back on good terms with the Saudis or the Turks, which then opens up a land route for an invasion of Iran. However, we're not at that point now. This means that the only route the US could use to invade Iran is an amphibious invasion through the Persian Gulf. The one silver lining here is that we have good relationships with the Gulf principalities, who would be able to supply us for the invasion. The bad news is literally everything else. Before we continue, for a shameless plug, please donate to my cancellation insurance at Pluribus with the link below, or check out my podcast, also with the link below, Common Ground. To start, amphibious invasions or attacking the land from the sea is legendarily difficult. In army slang, there's a truism: expect everything that can go wrong to go wrong in amphibious invasions. The reason the invasion of Normandy at D-Day is so famous is that an amphibious invasion of that scale is insanely difficult to pull off correctly. The Allies had been setting up D-Day for 2 years before it was actually launched. This doesn't even factor in launching an amphibious invasion on what's literally the other side of the Earth from your home country. There are 3 spots where I see the Americans launching an amphibious attack. The main strategic choke point we have to take for this whole war to continue is the Straits of Hormuz. The entire Persian Gulf empties through this strait. Keep in mind, a majority of the world's oil flows through the Straits of Hormuz. If the Iranians cut it, it will bring global trade to its knees. If the US can't secure the Straits of Hormuz, it suddenly makes the war incredibly unpopular among the global population. The US doesn't really need this oil, as the US has now become oil self-sufficient, but the US's allies definitely do. If the Straits of Hormuz are cut, Japan, Europe, and China's economies will tank to horrifying levels. If the US was a more Machiavellian country, it would purposely cut this trade, since it would massively increase the value of our oil exports, and through process of elimination make us the world's top economic superpower through making the rest of the world weak due to massive increases in the price of oil. I can happily promise to the rest of the world, though, that this is not how the Biden administration's mind works. If the US is invading Iran, and added to by the anti-American sentiment that dominates a lot of the world, including America's allies, you would see pressure to end the war on the part of the US. There would be protests in Germany, Japan, or China that the US was an aggressor destroying the world system. It doesn't matter if rationally it makes sense, in the same manner that people protest Israel defending itself in the current war. What matters is that people feel angry and don't like the Americans. A lot of the global left strangely prefers radical Islam to the American mainstream as well. This would create a ticking time bomb for the US to end the war as soon as possible if the Straits of Hormuz aren't captured. Another problem here is that the US can't launch amphibious invasions on almost the entirety of Iran's coastline if they can't take the Straits of Hormuz. They can only launch attacks in Baluchistan if this is the case, boxing the war in a tiny region of Iran, very far away from Iran's main population centers and capital. The problem here is that the geography of the Straits of Hormuz and the advances in military technology give the Iranians an advantage in this battle. One of the biggest changes in military technology has been the advances in missiles, rockets, and especially using GPS to target enemy forces. This was a change that military writer James F. Dunnigan noticed even in the early 80s, so it's not like this was slept on or super recent, but missile technology changes the calculus calculus in naval warfare. Dunnigan made the argument that aircraft carriers had become useless since, with targeted missiles, and this is only more true with GPS, can knock out an aircraft carrier operating on the coast pretty easily due to their giant size and open surfaces. Aircraft carriers did really well in the era in which their main threat were planes, since the aircraft carrier could always carry enough planes to fight off attacking planes. However, with rockets, this isn't the case. They're just sitting ducks. This is very similar to what happened with battleships in World War II. Before then, battleships were awe-inspiring, enormous behemoths with massive guns that could destroy anything. The battleships could carry bigger guns than anything on land, since they were floating in the water, and thus they could carry them, and the ocean displaced the pressure of the blast. However, with the invention of the plane, they became strategically useless, while the aircraft carrier replaced them as the king of the sea. Ironically, rockets are doing to the aircraft carrier what the aircraft carrier did to the battleship. The problem here is the Straits of Hormuz have the worst possible geography for the Americans. The region is surrounded on 3 sides by land, so the Iranians have 3 separate axes where they can put rockets to blow up the American fleet, and we've basically maximized the space for Iranian firepower. However, the US military has been winning for so long, I guess they'd go in with aircraft carriers in the Gulf to try to use air power to overrun the Iranians. Even for any other kind of ship, the geography of the Straits of Hormuz gives an advantage to land-based rockets. However, with the US, and this is generally true of dominant militaries who have won many previous wars, is that they develop entrenched interests around certain types of fighting. As the world changes, they keep these combat styles, which then results in them losing battles or wars while having very expensive weaponry and highly trained troops, since they can't keep up with the new changes in warfare and doctrine. Since they assume their victory, they haven't gone to the effort of changing. The underdog, meanwhile, has to change their tactics and be creative since victory isn't assured for them. You saw this process occur with the French in World War II, the British Army with the Boer War, the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, the British in the American Revolution, the Prussians in the Napoleonic War, and you could go on forever. Although the Pentagon isn't sharing their papers and war plans with me, as far as I can tell, the US has kept a World War II era doctrine of maximizing firepower. This also fits with American politics and culture with minimizing death tolls. American command has also become less fluid over the last few decades, in which the personal initiative of commanders has been discounted for hierarchy. Thus, my guess would be that the US would go into this with a plan of basically blowing up the Iranians with as much firepower as possible. As a general rule, trying to use firepower to win wars is ineffective. For one, it's never been effective. The US dropped more sheer explosives on North Vietnam than the entirety of World War II combined. The Allies dropped some unholy amount of bombing on Germany, but the year in which Germany had the most industrial output of World War II was 1944, towards the end of the war. The Germans dropped some ungodly amount of shells on a single mile of Verdun for days straight and still lost that battle. Shelling is politically useful since it doesn't involve your men dying, but it's also not that effective. When people say drones will replace infantry, this is why that's not going to happen. Also, Iran's mountainous geography will negate a lot of the advantages firepower gives, as firepower is much less effective in the mountains. In my opinion, the deciding factor in the Battle of the Straits will be leadership. If the Iranians have good leadership, they can destroy the entire American fleet here and end the war. If the Americans do, they'll win it and continue the invasion. It kind of reminds me of the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I, where the British invaded Turkey, which was also an Anglo-Empire invading a Middle Eastern country by water. Gallipoli could have worked, but the Turkish leader where the British landed was Ataturk, one of the greatest leaders in Turkish history. His presence there saved the Turkish nation. It was a big scandal inside the Pentagon 15 years ago when the US would have war room exercises on who would win a battle between the Americans and Iranians in the Straits of Hormuz, and a smart player who was playing for the Iranian side as an American was able to win the battle over 10 times in a row against the Americans. Americans. The US command couldn't believe what they were seeing. If the Americans win and seize the Straits of Hormuz, they have secured the Persian Gulf and can attack along 3 axes, in my opinion. One is to attack Baluchistan in the southeast. This is a separatist region inhabited by an ethnic minority, the Baluchis, that don't like the Persian central government. It wouldn't surprise me if they treat the Americans as liberators. The second spot is in Abadan, Iran's southern port along the Persian Gulf. Securing this would give the Americans the road north to Tehran. The third spot is in the southwest near the border with Iraq for opening up another front to weaken the Iranians. This area is inhabited by ethnic Arabs. If we're being honest, the smart thing for the US to do would be to stop here, consolidate its gains along the coast, and shut down Iran's oil production. However, I'm not sure it'd be wise enough to do that. Assuming the Americans land on the south coast, what would an invasion across Iran look like? I think a common misconception Americans have is they view the Middle East as a homogenous region of Arabs who are religious fanatics which ride camels. This couldn't be further from the truth. All the countries in this region are incredibly different in most ways, with vastly different histories that go back thousands of years. For example, with Iraq and Afghanistan, the US chose to invade one of the easiest countries in the world to conquer, and one of the hardest at the same time. Iraq is a dead flat plain with a non-warlike population which has spent the entirety of its history for the 2,500 years before the end of British colonialism by being ruled by foreign conquerors. Iraq is one of the easiest places in the world to conquer and govern. Afghanistan is the exact opposite. It's mountainous, inhabited by some of the mightiest warriors in the world, and is basically impossible to conquer, spewing out countless invaders who ravaged the neighboring countries. Afghanistan has chewed up the British, Russian, and American invaders in just the last few centuries. It's no surprise then that the US invasion of Iraq succeeded in like a week, while that of Afghanistan was a failure. Persia, or the older name for Iran, is geographically between Iraq and Afghanistan, and is a pretty good cultural midpoint between both countries. The Persians have been civilized for thousands of years, but haven't completely lost their warrior spirit like the Iraqis. Iran is mountainous, but not as much as Afghanistan. Iran is in the good position of being able to combine part of the toughness of the Afghans with the civilization of the Iraqis. Another factor is that Iran, like Turkey, is one of the very few industrialized countries in the Middle East. People don't know this, but most Iranians live in cities. It's a place with factories, cars, and all the hallmarks of an industrialized society, which would make it harder for the Americans to conquer it. Iranians are also pretty educated as a population, which is not what I think most Westerners would expect. The US's dominant strategy in its conflict since World War II has been blitzkrieg. We adopted the Germans' World War II tactics of using combined arms attack to rapidly destroy enemies before they're able to react and think about what's going on. We were able to do this quite successfully in both Iraq wars, and it's why we won them so quickly. The problem is that blitzkrieg, or as the Americans have renamed it to be less edgy, shock and awe, is completely ineffective in mountain warfare, that which encompasses the majority of Iran's terrain. Mountainous terrain is especially difficult to launch attacks in modern warfare due to the roads needed for tanks or modern supply chains. If launching an amphibious invasion is difficult, launching an amphibious invasion followed by attacking hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain is insane. If you go through the successful military advances of the modern world, all are on flat terrain, since military breakthroughs in modernity have been dependent on the tank to counterattack the defensive power of the machine gun and trench. Tanks only operate well on flat ground. As the American troops would try to fight their way through the Iranian mountains, they'd be facing World War I-like trench warfare, in which tank offensives through mountain passes wouldn't be effective, as the mountain passes would create places where the artillery and rockets can slaughter tanks trying to push forward. The US's main strategic advantages are in air power, naval power, and firepower. Mountain terrain negates all of these. In a mountainous region like Italy or Korea, they're both peninsulas, so America is able to use its naval advantage to attack behind enemy lines, pulling them back. This won't work in Iran. Iran's mountainous terrain counteracts all of the US's advantages. On a purely military level, the US invasion of Iran is a horrible idea that would not go well at all. The US would lose an invasion of Iran. Furthermore, another factor I'd like to throw in is that if you look at the last 70 years, they've consistently shown less advanced militaries have been able to punch above their weight with much more technologically advanced industrial ones. The most recent example being Hamas's invasion of Israel, which was more successful than anyone expected it to be. Alternately, the Ukrainians needed to fight off the Russians. The Afghans beating both the Americans and the Soviets, the North Vietnamese defeating the Americans, and more. And so what this has all meant is that it wouldn't surprise me if the Iranians could massively punch above their weight and defeat a much larger American force, since that's been the dominant trend of our era, of less technologically advanced militaries being able to defeat much more advanced ones. I could see this being the modern equivalent of a Teutoburger Wald or a Karhai. In both of them, Roman armies were wiped out by much weaker opponents, and it was completely shocking to everyone at the time because the Romans were seen as the greatest military in the world. And for Teutoburger Wald as an example, the Germans pulled Roman forces into terrain that negated all of Rome's military advantages, or the cold forests of North Germany, and slaughtered them. And I think the Iranians could do that to the Americans here. Wars are not purely won by militaries. What is as important is the societies that are fighting each other. The term élan means the collective military drive of an army. An army with élan fights heroically while one without it gives up. Besides élan, the logistics of a society and its industrial abilities, or if it has the money or manufacturing for a war, is also one of the biggest factors that determines if it's going to win. The US and Iran today are both on shaky grounds as societies and countries, which is generally true of everywhere in the world. The problems in the US are self-evident, and I've spent so many other videos talking about them that I won't do so here. However, for simplification, the US is an incredibly divided country. People often talk without exaggeration that the US is on the verge of civil war. For the last 2 elections, both sides have refused to agree to consent to the other side winning. The US budget is on the brink of bankruptcy, with the US only barely passing budgets to keep its government operating every few months. Iran is also in rough shape. Their economy is really struggling due to the sanctions the Western world has put upon them. Their Islamic fundamentalist ruling elite is facing a serious crisis, as Iran has become a very secular society. At this point, only a third of Iranians identify as Shia Muslim, while their ruling class's identity is entirely based around Shia Islam. Iran at this point is a less religious country with a lower birth rate than America. We've all seen the mass protests that have rippled over Iran in the last few years, showing how unpopular the mullahs are. Iran and America are both in rough shape, and I believe to be a few screws away from collapsing in revolution. However, I think this war would have opposite effects upon the US and Iran's governments. The most telling difference is that although the American and Iranian governments are both unpopular, the American dissidents are very well armed while the Iranians are not. The general popularity of the government around the public doesn't matter. What matters is the popularity of the government among the people with weapons or the levers of power and connection. In Iran, although I know there's a lot of stuff I don't know about, it seems as if the military and the people with the levers of power and organizational ability have been bought into the ruling class by the mullahs. The general public can hate the mullahs as much as they'd like, but as long as the military still backs them, a revolution won't work. There's no incentive at this point for the people with the guns to defect, since the military is in fact more religious than the mainstream government, so they'd lose their authority in a new regime. I think the Americans will expect the Iranians to rebel for freedom when they're invaded. This is retarded, but it's what we believed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were wrong both times. When you invade people's countries, people almost never greet the invaders as liberators. You can't expect people to like being conquered, and their own people and ethnicity are losing authority. The Iranians don't like their government, but also I don't get the impression they want to be ruled by the Americans either. If we invade Iran, it will pull the Iranian people together against the Americans. They'll be defending their homeland. In fact, if America invades Iran, it will probably legitimize the mullahs against the foreign invaders. This would play very well with Persian nationalists, with them supporting their own people against the invaders. This is important since I see the Persian nationalists as the only faction that has the capability to unify the public and drive out the Shia imams. An interesting scenario that I think is decently plausible is that if the the war gets big enough and it turns into a Persian total war in which the Iranians arm their population, is that you have an entire generation of young Persian men who are well armed and trained, and generally don't like the centralized government, and also don't like the traditional theocracy, but they'd be fighting this war for Persian nationalist reasons. And so what I could see is that a commander from this war just makes himself dictator and builds Persia on new nationalist grounds, knocking out the imams. In America, this looks very different. Over the last few years, the Democrats, which is the party of the ruling class, have become the party of foreign policy aggressiveness. Meanwhile, the Republicans and the right have become the party of isolationism. Especially if this happens right now under the Biden administration, the invasion of Iran will be politicized as a left-wing issue. This is very important since literally everything gets politicized in America today, which determines how or why it gets implemented. The problem here is that the invasion of Iran would split the left in half. The liberal deep state would support it, but the social justice vortex they pull legitimacy from would hate it. They'd view it as oppressive white people trying to colonize a peaceful ethnic brown country in the same manner they support Palestine today. These people do not view war as a rational thing that's necessary sometimes, and view it as always evil, especially when waged by a white against a non-white country. It would be even worse since there'd be no split of do I support the Jewish oppressed people versus the Palestinian oppressed. It would be evil American empire against Muslim oppressed. A war in Iran would be unanimously hated by the populist left, alienating them from the mainstream Democrats. The leftist media would try to spin this as a war for freedom and women's rights, but it wouldn't work. I actually think an invasion of Iran would kill and divide the American left. It would collapse in infighting. The American left is based around social approval and supporting the current correct thing. However, with the unity removed for deciding what is the current correct thing to support to be a good person, I think it would break the brain of this movement. Meanwhile, the people who would actually be fighting this war, as in young men, the enlisted men and officers, tilt markedly right-wing. They would hate fighting what would be viewed as a left-wing war. America is so divided I could literally see the military mutinying and refusing to fight. Fighting-age men, or those in their late teens to early 20s, tilt 2-to-1 conservative to liberal. This would be even more true of the brave, competent young men who would provide leadership and spearhead the war. Guys my age have no bad blood with Iran since the war on terror was occurring when we were babies, unlike the boomer elite. If we had a war to motivate young men to fight, we'd have to pull on values like freedom, nationalism, and Christianity, and other strong things like that. However, our current deep state would be incapable of doing that because they hate all those things. They would instead try to use wokeness, except there's no reason to get young, mostly white men to die for causes that actively hate them. The US military would be incapable of getting their young men motivated for war. If you want to know how bad the publicity for this war would be, keep in mind how unpopular the war in Iraq was, and then remember how much more peaceful and unified our society was back then. Imagine if we had an Iraq war today, but the actual fighting was much, much more difficult. The US now, in peacetime, is 25% beneath its yearly recruitment targets to keep the military operating. If we had a major war, we'd need to recruit even more young men. This would fail as there's no reason for young men to fight in a woke military in a country far away for deep state special interests that have nothing to do with them. Thus, I think the US would try to institute a draft to make up for its lack of young men in the military, especially since an invasion of Iran would take a field army probably numbering in the hundreds of thousands. A recent survey by the military found that 3/4 of Gen Z young men aren't fit for military service due to obesity and mental health issues. I mean, I'm 22, and I know loads of kids who can't function on the most basic level, like asking a girl on a date or doing a road trip, let alone waging war. This is also in addition to Gen Z being completely disinterested in the draft. The aggressive young men who would normally provide leadership to motivate the rest to wage war are all right-wing and despise the left and the establishment. The kinds of people who like the ruling class, the left, are completely incapable of fighting. If they tried to implement a draft, the effect would be refusal to comply. If they tried harder, there would be a right-wing revolution. So many of the young men who would refuse to fight in Iran would be happy to destroy the government. Why would they die in some far-off desert for some deep state interest when they could die killing the ruling class, which has spit on and kicked them for their entire lives? However, the boomer elite is so disconnected from the youth that I could totally see them pushing for a draft, having no idea of how much it will backfire. The boomers have no concept for how angry and desperate young people, especially Gen Z young men, are. The obvious reaction from Gen Z would be, "You guys dodged Vietnam. Why do you get to draft me?" A war would be tremendously expensive as well. The US has barely been passing budgets for the last few months. Each time, they pass with the Republicans giving some more concessions. If the Biden administration starts a war, the Republicans will just refuse and say that the government's shutting down. A war, one made by the other side, will just be too much pressure. I think this goes the other way, where if a Republican administration starts a war, the Democrats will refuse to have funding for it. The US doesn't have the elite cohesion for this. The US government would shut down and the government would default. This would cause a global economic crisis. Also, if the US government shuts down, it can't pay for the soldiers, so the war doesn't work. For all these reasons, I think a US war with Iran would be imperial suicide. The effect would be to benefit Iran, to perhaps keep a regime alive that's otherwise doomed. The US would be unable to sustain this war, either an actual military ability or an internal unity. If the US declares war on Iran and invades it, it will be one of the worst strategic decisions in world history, in my opinion. However, it's a miscalculation that I could totally see our boomer elite making. The boomers are horrible at empathy or theory of mind. They're permanently stuck as intellectual teenagers who need to rebel against responsibility and who are self-focused, mostly on hedonism. I think for the boomer deep state, they might start a war to unify the population, and since they hate Iran due to the decades of rivalry relating especially to the war on terror, they might assume that they could use it to whip up support among the young. They wouldn't realize young guys my age don't dislike Iran, and don't really dislike radical Islam either, often viewing it as the forbidden fruit and the opposite of wokeness. I could also see the boomers miscalculating on how much the population hates them, and how weak their power is, thus not realizing how easy it is for their entire empire to dissolve. I also predict them overestimating America's military strength. In total, an invasion of Iran would be a horrible mistake, but it's one that I could very easily see the elite make. An interesting thing you might notice is that I have America losing a war with Iran here, but in my simulation for a war with China and Russia that I made around a year ago, I think that a war with China is one that America would win. And that's because China is a big enough external threat that both sides of the political compass agree on enough that I think could unify America to beat China. And also, it's a normal style industrial war, not trying to conquer a mountainous country with trench warfare. And the irony is that a war with China is a big enough war that America could win, but a war with Iran is a small enough war that America would have to lose. The saddest thing is, you know who a war with Iran would benefit the most? Russia and China. With the US bogged down in the Middle East, the Russians might attack the Baltics. The Chinese would feel the need to attack Taiwan in order to be able to attack when the American empire is at their weakest. Through the American imperium weakening, our rivals would grow much stronger, and I can promise that they would not be nice rulers.